George Raft was arguably one of the most successful actors of his generation, but he died poor and was largely forgotten after making many dire mistakes. Join Factsverse to learn more about his life and career as we present George Raft Died Poor and Alone After His Mistakes. George Raft was born as George Raft on September 26, 1901 in Hell's Kitchen, Manhattan. He came from a working-class background and had to work at a young age to help support his family. He worked as an errand boy and even worked on wrapping fish from the local market. He left school in his early teens and went straight to work to continue to survive, including working as an electrician. Owing to his natural strength, he soon realized he could make some real money as a prize fighter. He took boxing lessons during his early teens, and by his mid-teens was fighting professionally. His boxing name was Dutch Raft, and there are various accounts of how many fights he engaged in. But every record seems to state he won the majority of them. He briefly played baseball and tried to make a living from it, but eventually quit as he wasn't the best hitter. He even trained as a dancer under his mother's supervision and would dance at carnivals and local fairs. This was one of his earliest experiences working with show business and gave him a taste for entertaining others. Eventually, he became so successful as a dancer that he began to tour the US and Europe. He would perform at nightclubs, on Broadway, and in speakeasies. He's credited with helping make the tango popular in European cities like Paris, Rome, and London. He also helped popularize the dance in his native New York. He was becoming a bit of a celebrity among dancers, and this made him some big money. It also got him acquainted with some big people, including some dangerous ones, some of the most notorious gangsters of their time. This was the start of his rise, but would simultaneously be the start of his downfall. George Raft's career. Raft moved to Hollywood in 1927 and decided to try his luck at acting after he had been suggested to do it by a friend. His first film is now considered a lost film, but even if we found it, we couldn't see him. It was a film called Queen of the Nightclubs, and he had a small role as a dancer, though all his scenes were cut. Nevertheless, he'd been bitten by the acting bug, and soon realized he had a future in Hollywood. His earliest films focused on him being a dancer, so he often worked in musicals. But as the 1930s approached, he began to turn in a new direction and started acting in gangster films, first as a supporting actor and soon as a lead. One of his first notable roles was in the film Taxi, in which he co-starred with James Cagney, with whom he'd later work in many films. While Cagney is perhaps more remembered as the bigger star, George Raft's performances were always appreciated and lauded. But Taxi was a film where George played a dancer competing with Cagney's character. His first big break in a gangster film was when he appeared alongside Paul Muni in Scarface. He played Guino Rinaldo, who was the main character's right-hand man. The film brought him fame, and from then onward, George was known as the typical gangster actor. While he had a versatile career, and one of his most notable roles was in Billy Wilder's comedy Some Like It Hot, he remains best known for his work in gangster films. His notable films include Night After Night, Midnight Club, The Bowery, It Had to Happen, I Stole a Million, Around the World in 80 Days, and The Man with Bogart's Face, which was his final film released in 1980. He had become such a huge star that he even appeared as himself in a few notable films, including Casino Royale, Deadhead Miles, and Sextet. George Raft was also so high in demand that other actors wanted to work alongside him, and he worked with the best, including James Cagney, David Niven, Edward G. Robinson, Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon, and Mae West. He was also offered many great roles which he turned down, and then was replaced by other major stars. You might have enjoyed watching Humphrey Bogart in The Big Shot, while the role was originally intended for George Raft. Fred MacMurray's character in Double Indemnity was originally intended for Raft as well, as was Alexander Scorby's role in The Big Heat. Some other major films that he turned down include The Story of Temple Drake, Belle of the 90s, Stolen Heaven, St. Louis Blues, City Conquest, High Sierra, and most notably, The Maltese Falcon, where once again he was replaced by Humphrey Bogart. That's how big of a star George Raft was. Without a doubt, he was one of the best actors of his generation. While he was known mostly for his gangster films, he managed to also have a separate and equally successful career as a dancer. He loved to play villains, but he mostly wanted to play villains who had some redeeming qualities, which is why he turned down certain roles that he felt were too bleak or sadistic. He lived large and was a major celebrity in his time. You could always find George roaming the streets of Hollywood or at the latest nightclubs. He was in every way a star, and at the time, it was almost unthinkable that he'd be forgotten by Hollywood or by film fans. But today, perhaps only the discerning cinephile knows a lot about George Raft. George Raft died poor and alone after his mistakes. So what were the mistakes that George Raft made that led to his downfall? He earned more than many of his co-stars at the time. It's believed that during his entire career he earned $10 million, and this would be a lot more today adjusted for inflation. Yet most of his money ran out when he died because he spent a lot of it on gambling and a lot on women. He was quite the womanizer and loved to spend money on them. He kept in touch with many of his gangster friends, and they got him involved in many of these bad habits. He avoided becoming a criminal himself, but he grew up in tough circumstances, and this followed him throughout his life. He lived his life to the fullest, and this attitude is what made him a success, but ultimately led to him making mistakes with his money, which caused him to die poor and alone. George Raft died November 24, 1980, at age 79. This was the same year his final film was released. So, even though he struggled with his finances, he still continued to act until his dying day, partly because of his passion for the craft, but also because he likely always needed the money. He's often thought of as Hollywood's forgotten star, and many of the stars he worked with and those who replaced him became more well-known than he is. Now it's time to hear from you. Are you a fan of George Raft? Did you know he died poor and alone after his mistakes? Let us know in the comments section below.